it is well known that the exact language of the so-called Ten Commandments, which the correct translation actually of the Hebrew term Aseret Ha-Devarim, or as it's colloquially called Aseret Ha-Dibrot, would be 10 maybe sayings, 10 things, 10 sentences, not really 10 commandments. There are more commandments than 10 in these. But at any rate, there are two versions of it. One that we, of course, read in this week. On the Shabbat, we're going to be reading about revelation at Mount Sinai and how the Jewish people heard the 10 sayings. And the second version is mentioned in the book of Deuteronomy, Dvarim, the second Parshat VaEtchanan, where Moshe recalls before dying in the last month and 7 days of his life. He recalls various things, tells the Jewish people, the new generation of Jews that are about to enter the land of Israel, tells various moral lessons, and among other things, mentions the Sinaitic revelation. And the differences are not major, but there are some specific differences between the two Nusachayot. And there was an old dispute already about what exactly does it mean. Why are there two versions of it? So one possibility is that the second Luchot, the second tablets that Moshe brought down, had the second version written on them. The Talmud in Tractate Baba Kama mentions such a possibility. There are other possibilities too. The simplest understanding is that the explanation that Moshe gave before dying includes a kind of commentary that what Ibn Ezra and some other commentators agree that there was only one version, of course, that the Jewish people heard at Sinai, but later on Moshe explained certain things. For instance, we'll get in a moment to the difference between Zachor and Shamor on Shabbat. Remember the day of Shabbat or keep the day of Shabbat. What exactly those two commandments may mean. But in the first version it says Zachor, and the second it says Shamor. However, our sages, Chazal, the sages of the Talmud, they have a very interesting approach that the two versions in a way prophetically were heard at the same time. Meaning the way the Jewish people heard things was not how we hear things. A prophet can see things or hear things very differently. And among other things, the message that they got includes what had to be written in human language in two different versions. So sometimes, for instance, they would understand immediately that the aspect of Shabbat includes Zachor and Shamor, but because this cannot be said by human voice, by human language, therefore the Torah writes it in two different Nusachayot, two different versions. So Zachor, according to Chazal, means the positive part of Shabbat, making, for instance, Kiddush, making Shabbat a special day. This is all in Zachor, remember Shabbat. Shamor, keeping Shabbat, means not doing work on Shabbat, the commandment to abstain from work. So in the beginning of on Friday night, in the beginning of Shabbat, we usually say this song that was composed maybe 500 years ago in Tzfat, in the northern Israel, by somebody named Rabbi Shlomo Alkabetz, a Sephardic rabbi, a great payatan, poet, and this is a very well accepted song. Almost everybody says it before Shabbat. And among other things, we say that Shamor v'Zachor b'dibur echad hishme'anu kelei b'minchad. That Shamor and Zachor, in one word, God, who is one, gave to us, made us hear, literally made us hear. He made it possible for us to hear in one word two different aspects, Shamor v'Zachor. So, Kabbalistically speaking, Shamor and Zachor have to do with night and day also. The midah, what they call the quality of night and the quality of day. On day there is usually more active things. People are more active generally, especially before electricity was invented. People were more active during the day. Most of the Torah commandments are during daytime. Notice that there are very few commandments. Some are at any time, for instance, mezuzah. But a lot of commandments are only for daytime. A lot of positive commandments because that's the time of action. The exclusion might be during Pesach Seder, when there are a lot of commandments that apply to the night specifically. And that's why the Vilna Gaon thought that, in fact, the Seder night has qualities of the day. It's called day, and in a certain sense, it's active like day. But normally speaking, night is more passive time. So the Shamor aspect which has to do with negative commandments, not doing something, that applies, of course, throughout the entire Shabbat, but most of the time at night when people just eat and learn Torah and sleep. So that's when, they mostly have to just abstain from doing something that's forbidden. Whereas Zachor, the more active part of Shabbat, has to do with daytime more, with the active part. And that's why these two aspects in Kabbalah have to do with Sfirot, have to do with the way Hashem rules the world. For instance, it's known that Ramah, Rabbi Moshe Isserlis, who was the greatest halachic authority in terms of legal Jewish law for Ashkenazic Jews, right? All of us follow, in 90% of the cases or more, Ramah, as opposed to Sephardic Jews that follow Rabbi Yosef Karo. They lived more or less in the same time period, about 500 years ago. Rabbi Yosef Karo lived in northern Israel also, in Galilee, and Ramah lived in Krakow. So Ramah wrote the Minhagim for Ashkenazic Jews, and Rabbi Yosef Karo wrote the Minhagim for Sephardic Jews. So Ramah writes, even though most of his work has very little to do with Kabbalah, but sometimes he does quote Kabbalistic sources, including the Zohar, and he writes in terms of the correct breaking of the bread. We take, of course, two challahs on Shabbat, whether it's at night or during daytime. But the breaking of which challah, according to Ramah, depends on whether it's nighttime or daytime. At night, you break the lower challah, which has to do with the aspect of night, as I said, the shamor aspect, and the upper challah is broken during the daytime, according to him. There are other opinions too, and there are other minhagim too, but this is the most common minhag, to break the lower challah at night and the upper challah during daytime. And Ramah specifically says that there's a Kabbalistic reasoning behind this. And it has to do with these two aspects, Shamor and Zachor. Those who learned some Kabbalah will probably know what I'm hinting to, but of course, this goes beyond our lesson. I just wanted to mention this for those who know. At any rate, Shamor and Zachor are included as two separate positive commandments with regards to Shabbat. And while they may mean similar things, there is, at least according to Chazal, there is this difference between the more active, positive aspect versus abstaining from work. Now, by the way, this has nothing to do with yet another law of Shabbat of not doing any work. As I said, the 10 sayings, the 10 Aseret Ha-Devarim or Zibrot, they include more than 10 commandments. So with regards to Shabbat, there are a number of commandments. The Torah says not to do work, and this includes both positive and negative aspects in its own right. Meaning, if a person, chas v'shalom, breaks Shabbat, if they do work on Shabbat, they will not only break the negative commandment not to work on Shabbat, they also break the positive commandment to rest on Shabbat. So Shamor is actually also a positive commandment. It has to do with abstaining from work, but it's the positive part. In a lot of cases, we find certain mitzvot where there is a positive and negative aspect. And if a person breaks that mitzvah, they break both the positive and the negative aspect. So we see already at least 3 laws of Shabbat here. One law, that you have to make Shabbat a special day. That's active Zachor. Another positive commandment, but with regards to not doing an action, and that is resting on Shabbat. And yet a third commandment, not to break Shabbat, and that is not to do work on Shabbat. Plus there are a few details that may be considered separate commandments. It depends on the opinion, whether making sure that, for instance, the animals rest on Shabbat should be considered as a separate mitzvah or not, and things like that. So with regards to Shabbat, there are quite a number of commandments just in this one passage. And another difference between the first and second Nusach is that in the first Nusach, the reason to keep Shabbat, it says, is because Hashem created the world in 6 days or periods of time, as some might say. I'm not going to go into this more modern dispute of what we would consider days and what we should how we should understand these particular words. For simplicity's sake, let's say the idea is that Hashem says, I created the world in 6 days, rested on the 7th, and therefore by keeping Shabbat you testify that you believe in my creation of the world, that you believe in God. In a sense, Shabbat is one of the most important commandments in Judaism, besides the prohibition of worshipping idols, and of course the mitzvah of believing in Hashem. Shabbat is one of the most important commandments because it testifies that we believe that Hashem exists and rules over the world. So the reason to keep Shabbat in the first Nusach, in our weekly reading, will be to remember that Hashem created the world. However, in the second Nusach, it says a different reason. Again, before dying, Moshe told the new generation that because you were slaves in Egypt, therefore make sure you rest on Shabbat and your servants rest on Shabbat because you were slaves in Egypt. Maybe the reason for this difference is because the new generation already could have forgotten. The first generation that just came out of Egypt didn't need to be told, you were slaves in Egypt. This just happened 2 months ago. They just came out of Egypt. But the new generation, 40 years later, they needed to be reminded of this. Of course, there's more than one reason. There are a number of reasons why there is this difference between the first and second version of the reason for the keeping Shabbat. But I'm just giving a simple reason. And according to the opinion that the Jewish people heard both, at the same time, we must say that the reasons also, they understood immediately that there is a social aspect of Shabbat to make sure everybody can rest, even the lowest, the servants. And at the same time, there is, of course, a ritual aspect of Shabbat to remember that Hashem created the world. And on this, I'm going to end. If you like this video, please press like and please subscribe to our channel.